How interesting that 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 bright insight would bring up such a rather interesting thing, which in turn reminded me of something that I once saw back in the back in like 2016, 2017, 2018, probably 2017. This is one of his more recent videos, which I will link to a card. Which I'll link in the description. But rather interesting. Where have I seen someone talk about hieroglyphs? Let's see if we got here. Yes. This wonderful classic of a video by the one and only Danny Wilten. I decided we upload that video. Even though it's already up on YouTube, it's unlisted. But I felt very much compelled to re-upload this video, to make this video visible to people again, because I felt like what it had to offer related to the discussion, which Bright Insight brought up. How did the ancient Egyptians know what they knew? It's a very good question. How the hell did they know this?
Hey everybody, let's take a look at something real quick. So this is from Job 9:9. He made all the stars, the bear Orion, Pleiades, and the constellations of the southern sky. Notice that it says the southern sky and not all of the sky. It says the southern sky. And that means that whatever made these constellations has to be in the southern sky or the southern heaven. King James Bible says chambers of the south. That's the same thing as the constellations of the southern sky. Now let me show you something really quickly. Circling back around because I hadn't pulled this Bible verse out when I showed it the first time. These numbers are pulled from a NASA site. They're all, no matter where you go, are relatively within a few light years of each other. Not much of a difference. This chart that you see up here is a distance of the star from the Earth, and the brown is the age of the star, which NASA has declared. So if we take a look at these stars starting from Bellatrix, the distance being the closest, Bellatrix is up here, by the way. So, and as we move along this Fibonacci spiral that we see right here, and you see how these stars are jumping out and moving up. Take a look at Betelgeuse right here, and you see how it's moving up. It's got a trail of this Barnard's loop coming off of it, which is this large Fibonacci spiral that circles into the Orion Nebula. What you're actually seeing here is you're looking at the Orion Nebula would be the farthest away from us, and this loop right up here would be the closest to us. So as the spiral moves this way, it's getting farther and farther away from us. Okay. So, well, here's the interesting thing. The interesting thing is the distance as we move around this spiral of these various stars, Bellatrix, then Betelgeuse, then Siph, Rigel, Alnitak, Mintaka. As you move down this, the age versus the distance is almost a smooth line. And that means as these stars approach the Orion Nebula, they get younger. The oldest stars are the stars farthest away from it. Now NASA declares that the Orion Nebula is younger than all the stars in Orion. But recently they published an article saying that they might have to revisit the age of the stars in Orion. And this is, of course, after I published my information on this, because NASA and these agencies do not have the ability to look at simple observations. It's quite easy. It's Analyst 101 to be able to say if all these stars, age versus distance, is a smooth line towards the Orion Nebula, that most likely the candidate for which created the stars in the Orion constellation is the Orion Nebula, because you have a smooth line moving all the way down distance to age. This down here has something to do with velocity of the Orion Nebula, and I was calculating the velocity of the Orion Nebula as if it were moving across from here to here, and roughly moved at a decent, this little wavy line right here is kind of the way we would see this this spiral right here as it moves, as it twists through the sky. And right in the middle of that, of course, is we know it makes stars, and that is a so-called black hole that we call. But we know that the Orion Nebula makes stars. The likely candidate for the maker of the Orion constellation is the Orion Nebula, and that brings us back to this. He makes all the stars, the Bear, Orion, Pleiades, and constellations of the southern sky.
So when we think of Egypt, and we think of the ancients, and we think of what they saw a long time ago, the only credit that we give them is what we can see currently in the sky. And I'm about to show you something here from a glyph of theirs that represents the constellation Orion. This right here that you're seeing is probably being nice for what we normally can see today, because normally you can't even see the Orion Nebula. It just looks like a fuzzy star up there. But more than that, we obviously can't see all of the gases that surround the whole Orion constellation. And the glyph I'm going to show you, I believe, shows that that the ancient Egyptians could see a lot more than we currently believe. We think that everything, or at least the most Egyptologists, even the ones that are forgiving, the ones that actually stem beyond the regular Egyptology that goes on right now, which is kind of a joke. But the guys like even, like the Graham Hancocks and the Robert Bivals and stuff like that, even those guys that are well respected, I believe that they still think that they could only see the stars. And I think this is common among most of the people. But the glyph I'm going to show you shows something quite different. First, let's take a look at what another site said. Now this right here is a rebuttal from somebody who wrote, I believe, Christ in Egypt. It was a great book from what I could see. But I want you to see what happens right here. And this is the common mistake I see. First of all, I never really have liked the idea that people say that the belt stars point to Sirius, or that they point to anything. In my experience, and looking at what the Egyptians have done a long time ago, when they wanted to point to something, they actually showed it to you. And not only that, these stars are not in a straight line. So that means you have to choose if you want to go with the line connecting the first and third belt star, or if you want to go with the first and second, or if you want to go with the second and third. Because you're going to get 3 different lines depending on what you do there. To say that these point to Sirius, I never really have cared for that too much. But let's listen to what he has to say here. Because his rebuttal, the person who wrote Horus was not adored by 3 kings. And so he responds, he says, the motive of the divine child being greeted by dignitaries at his birth dates back thousands of years, long before Jesus supposedly existed. Regardless of whether or not the figure is 3, 4, 6, or more or less, the point is that the birth of a divine child, who is subsequently adored by dignitaries, is not new or unique to Christianity. We know that from texts and other artifacts that Egyptian religion, for one, possessed the motif of the Savior and the divine child being heralded by 3 notable personages, numbering 3 or more, who can be called the 3 kings. In the case of Osiris and the elder Horus being born around the summer solstice, these three kings are the three stars in the belt of the Orion constellation. Now here is where I believe that people tend to go wrong. Look at the glyph. Okay, the glyph is showing the three belt stars right here. Now, if the Egyptians were so precise with all of their other glyphs showing, people standing up, their phi ratios to people's belly button, and so why, if they were so precise with all of that, why wouldn't they be somewhat precise with their glyphs as well? Because he says, which points to the star Sirius at the horizon during the births of these gods at the summer flooding of the Nile. Well, right here, when you hover over this, it says Egyptian hieroglyph for Orion, representing the three stars in the belt of Orion with the star Sirius. But that's not the star Sirius. Let me show you something from Orion Zone with Gary David. Here it is again. Notice the size of the star, right? Compared to the three belt stars also. O King, you are this great star, the companion of Sa. And people think because it says companion that they automatically assume it's Sirius, but it's not Sirius. Who traverses the sky with Sa, who navigates the Duat, the underworld, with Osiris. You ascend from the east of the sky, being renewed, resurrected, at your due season and rejuvenated at your due time. So this guy here thinks that this is the star Sirius, and he's over here, he's pointing to the star Sirius. But that looks nothing like what we see in the glyph. Additionally, what I want you to notice is that this glyph has these curves coming off of the three stars right here. That's done for a reason. And just like I showed you right here, this is what we assume that the Egyptians could see. But there's much more. There's much, much more once you actually show what's really going on inside of Orion. So, Orion comes to life when we can see all of the gases and everything else that exist out there. So, although we believe that the Egyptians could see this, the truth is they could see much more. And I believe that whether they could see that I don't believe it was something had to do with the just them being able to normally be able to see something. I think that they somehow could peer into the cosmos and see much more than we know. It's only because now we have the proper telescopes being able to do long exposures and stuff that we can actually see what's really going on out there. And this is why I believe that one of the reasons I believe for a fact that these Egyptians could actually see what was going on as far as the gases and so forth, which means they could also see the spiral and everything going on out there, is because when we take a look at the three belt stars, you're going to notice that what is coming off of these top two belt stars right here, we have two curved lines of gas. And so when we look at the hieroglyph, giving the Egyptians the credit that they deserve, because when we take a look at the hieroglyph and we stretch these out to where the belt stars are on each line, and notice that the big star that it's referring to is right under the center star. That's exactly what we see in here. And these curved lines of gas coming off these two stars that you see at the top here, and probably something that we could probably see a little bit better. It looks like there's some gas coming off that one. But these especially right here, you can see the curved lines of gas that come off those two stars. That shows that the Egyptians, from what I can see with their hieroglyph, based on the size of this star, which covers the whole nebula area, its distance to this upper part of the glyph, and the width where each one of these stars falls in line with this, and the curved gas coming off, then this right here represents the great star. You are this great star, the companion of Sa. And this, in my opinion, represents the Star of Bethlehem. It represents the star of Jesus. Sirius is a signal for the birth of Jesus. These guys announced the birth. And then when Sirius came up, was the signal that he was born. And so right here in front of our faces, we see the glyph proportionally matching with the width, the belt stars, the curved lines of gas coming off, and everything. So the idea that this star right here is Sirius cannot be. Because the Egyptians, when they showed us things, they were very precise about the way that they did things. So they drew these 3 belt stars and they put the large nebula underneath it. The great star that they're referring to is actually the nebula. And the reason that it says that it will sail the sky with Osiris is because Osiris is what sits in the very middle of that nebula, the hidden or the concealed one, the black hole, which sits in the very center of the great star, and that's the reason why he travels with Osiris and they both navigate the duat. And also remember that Horus is an aspect of Osiris, Horus. So there you go. I wanted to show that to you guys and show you why I believe that the Egyptians knew they could actually see much more than we give them credit for. And additionally, based on all of the artwork that we have seen, especially in the Church of the Jesu, showing the whole Orion loop coming around and centering on the Orion Nebula again, with IHS pasted right on top of the nebula. And this is what we keep seeing on all these other pieces of art from the collective unconscious. This right here, this is the Star of Bethlehem. This is the mysterious star. It's not Sirius. It's the Orion Nebula. It's the great star that we see inside of Orion. It's the divine child, the birth of divine child. This is the brain. Horus sits in the brain. Horus sits in the mind area, so we know this now. I thought you seeing the glyph would help you see that there's much more going on than what people give the Egyptians credit for. You guys take care. I'll talk to you soon. Hey everybody, well, I keep seeming to discover some very interesting Jewish mysticism. And so if you remember in the recent video I showed you this particular image of the Orion Nebula. It's called Journey to Heaven. And you see all these people journeying to heaven in the Orion Nebula. And it's on the BibleEncyclopedia.com. This is an actual picture of the Orion Nebula right here. These things keep popping up inside Bible Encyclopedia every time I'm looking for something specific related to the kind of research that I'm doing. And they just keep popping up. So I have a new one for you. And after you take a look at it, I think you're going to be pretty amazed. But then I'm going to proceed to explain to you why this thing keeps showing up in history. And I'm going to show you some examples from even some of the famous cathedrals that you've seen before. So I was doing more searches, and here we go on Bible Encyclopedia. Now we have Jesus on top of the Orion Nebula. Jesus in the Cosmos is what it's called. This is on Bible Encyclopedia. But you notice the key word here on this one right here is wisdom. And we're going to see why this is the reason why it popped up. And it's going to make a lot more sense. First of all, if we go to Colossians 1:15, we see that in the various parallel verses, and this comes from the first begotten, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. He existed before anything was created and is supreme over all creation. And that's what we see. Who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. So when we think of Christ, he is the firstborn over all creation. And so now we need to flip over and understand what this has to do with wisdom and what Christ actually represents. I want to show you a couple of familiar images you've probably seen before. And this is one from the Bible Encyclopedia.
Story in the Apocalypse of John. So we come to the great figure walking among the candlesticks, carrying the stars.
You see all these people on this pathway into heaven? Okay, this is the exact same thing that you see
and the Mother Jesuit Church, you see all these people moving in to the very center? Well, they're moving into the center of the Orion Nebula, just like what you see right here. Now, if you also notice, the symbol that you see right here is IHS, and IHS is another name for Jesus or Christ, and that's exactly what we see when we look right here. You've also seen this image in the creation of Adam, and what did he paint? He painted a brain. We'll see why that's important in just a second. And derived from that is the actual picture of a brain in profile, which is what we see right here, which is what the Orion Nebula is. So now we need to make sense of all this. Why a brain? Why wisdom? Why Christ? We'll see why it all makes sense. So right here I'm looking at the Kabbalah by Adolf Frank, translated by I. Sosnitz in 1926. So I'm going to get right to the page, and we're going to look up wisdom here. And we see that the Lord has through wisdom founded the earth. Well, if we remember that Son is the image of the invisible God, firstborn over all creation. Christ is the visible image. And what we see here is for in him all things were created, things in the heaven, on the earth, visible and invisible, thrones or powers. Now we see right here again, just to remind you, the Lord has through wisdom founded the earth. So we need to find out what wisdom is. Okay, we know that wisdom is associated to Christ. We know that Christ is the firstborn over all creation. So what's the tie to wisdom? So the form of the ancient wisdom, the form of the ancient whose name be sanctified is a unique form which embraces all forms. It is the supreme and mysterious wisdom which contains all the rest. Mysterious wisdom, the highest of crowns, which all diadems and crowns are adorned. From the bosom of this absolute unity, distinct various forms and all relative unity go forth as parallels, principles, but inseparable in reality, one male or active, which is called wisdom, or chokmah, or in the passive female, is designed by a word which is customary to translate by intelligence, or bina. Now, let's get an idea of what's being discussed here. We have the crown, the very top, which is kether, we have chokmah, and we have bina. So wisdom is also named the Father. It engenders all things by means of the 32 marvelous ways which it is diffused through the universe. It imposes a form and a measure on all that is. The intelligence is the mother. Okay. One head is the secret wisdom which is never unveiled. Mysterious wisdom is the supreme principle of all other wisdom. Above that first head is the ancient, whose name be sanctified. Here we go. The crown is the head, the wisdom is the brain, and the intelligence is the heart. So, logos is also wisdom, and we know Christ was called the Logos. So Christ is the brain. So everything was fashioned after the brain. I have this right here taken from this thing. This is an assembly of various texts taken from this, so I don't have to flip through it for you. God is good and wise by virtue of himself, for wisdom does not deserve its name because of itself. Because of him, he is wise, and who produces wisdom from the light that emanated. It's really interesting how Jewish mysticism somehow ties in the archetypes of the human form and these sayings which you would never know unless you knew what you were looking for. Okay, here we go again. God is good and wise by virtue of himself, for wisdom does not deserve its name because of itself, but because of him who is wise and who produces wisdom from the light that emanated from. So here's the light that emanates from, and from that light produces wisdom, and wisdom is the brain. Also named the Father, for it is said, wisdom engenders all things. By means of the 32 marvelous ways it diffused through the universe, it imposes a form and a measure on all that is. So this is the archetypal form, this brain right here. And after which it constructs a great vessel like the sea called intelligence, which the name of God, intelligent. No form, no world could subsist before the human form, for it contains all things, and all that is subsists only by virtue of it. Without it there would be no world, for as it is written in Proverbs 3:19, the Lord has through wisdom founded the earth. So the earth was founded after wisdom, and wisdom is the brain, and that's the reason why we see the brain on the earth, and that's the reason why we see the brain here in the cosmos. And so if we take a look at the tree of life, you'll get a better understanding as well. So the heavenly atom consists of all of these up here at the very top. And this is the crown. This is where the light emanates from. Chokmah, which is wisdom. This is Christ, which is the brain. And then Bina, which is not Saturn. It's actually the sea that the actual brain sits in. So it's the heavens that the brain creates. So once again, if we go back to here, we see that the crown is the head, wisdom the brain, intelligence the heart, the trunk and the breast, in short, the middle column is the beauty, the arms are the symbols of grace. So what we see is that so this particular light came into being, and then from that light emanates wisdom, which is the brain, and it becomes the archetype in Jewish mysticism for everything that is created. And that's the reason why the earth is created after wisdom, and that's why we see that the Lord hath through wisdom founded the earth, and that's the reason why we see Christ tied to wisdom right here, the Orion Nebula, which represents the brain, which everything is fashioned after. So this is the very interesting thing about Jewish mysticism. And then once again, on top of everything else, we actually have a picture of the Orion Nebula, which is what represents Christ. This is Jesus in the cosmos. It's the firstborn over all creation, as specifically said in the Bible. The Christ is the firstborn over all creation. Everything is created after him. So we have the initial light. And then we have, he's the first visible image after the invisible God. And he is also a representation of the archetypal man. Now here's something else that's really interesting as well. I looked up the etymology for man. And the etymology for man, we see that sometimes connected to root men, to think, mind, which would be the ground sense of man, one who has intelligence, but not all linguists accept this. Lieberman, for example, writes, the most probable man, human being, is a secularized divine name from Manus, believed to be the progenitor of the human race. which is tied to thinking. Manus, the mind thinker, which is exactly what Manly P. Hall says as well. So the image that you see of the creation of Adam, with him painting a mind, he's actually, what he's painting is he's painting Christ, because it's the same thing as what we're looking at right here. Because when we take a look at the creation of Adam, is the same thing as the Orion Nebula, and therefore that is Christ. So this is the demiurge, basically. Christ is the demiurge. Through everything, through him, the whole universe is created. And we can also verify this too, because we can see very mystical images showing close-ups, showing the same images that exist. So what this is that Michelangelo painted is the Christ. What this triangle represents is Kether, right here. So we have to break this out. So what this is this is Kether, this is the crown, the triangle that you see right here. And from that light emanated wisdom, which is the brain, which is what we see as the whole Orion Nebula, which is the archetypal image used to form the Earth. And then we see this sea that it all sits in, and that's Bina, which is the heavens, which is understanding. And so that's what these things mean when we see stuff like this. But yet here we go, just another instance of the same thing that I've shown you over and over again in all these cathedrals. Christ tied to the Orion Nebula. This is where things began. This is the archetype that first formed out of the infinite. And this is what the Egyptians were also pointing to with their pyramids as well. Because the top of the capstone, or the top of the pyramid, is missing its capstone. And that capstone has the same slopes as the trapezium of the Orion Nebula. What they were actually pointing us to is the same thing that we see all over the place. And Christ is the same thing as Hermes, which also is the hermit on the tarot, which represents wisdom. It represents the divine mind. There's a lot of different names. It's also it's the demiurge. It's the first thing that started creating everything. So there's a lot of different names tied to it across culture. And we even see tied, to Buddhism, associated with certain things in Buddhism, associated with Hindu. It has names all across cultures. Christ is just one of them, which represents the archetype that's man, that basically is the archetype of the world, and it's the archetype of man as well. So, anyways, I thought you guys would enjoy that, and just another instance of the same thing, showing the Orion Nebula, the area of focus that we need to be taking a look at. Y'all take care.